This was supposed to be the peak of COD Zombies, this once hidden and niche mode's chance to rise to the top of the industry. It's time to become the biggest thing in Black Ops 4. So what happened? As Treyarch's newest zombie experience approached its launch, hype in the community had never been this high. Everything was looking perfect, with insane amounts blowing people's minds and setting the stage for a year like no other. But once the game dropped, everything changed. It became very clear very quickly that there was huge problems. Overnight, the community realised that maybe things weren't as great as they'd expected as the arrival of Black Ops 4 descended into chaos. But unfortunately, this was just the start of a year-long journey that would change the franchise forever, and not for the better in many people's eyes. But in order to understand the true downfall of Black Ops 4 Zombies, we need to wind things back to 2015 and where this tragedy all began. Believe it or not, but the big problem with Black Ops 4 Zombies actually began in the absolute opposite way you would expect, by another title in the series setting the standard so high it was always doomed to fail. Throughout its year-long season, BO3 created the golden age of this famous mode. It took what at times had been a failing and struggling aspect of Call of Duty and capitalised massively on the insane excitement that had been created by the famous Origins many years earlier. Treyarch doubled down with the over-the-top, complicated and in-depth maps, and it's fair to say it worked. Shadows of Evil, Zetsubo no Shima, Gorod Krovi, some of the most complex experiences of all time, and they were in general received incredibly well by fans. Although sure, they would always have their haters, but overall they were considered to be, along with Der Eisendrache and Revelation, some of the greatest original content that Zombies players had ever gotten their hands on. As a Zombies package, Black Ops 3 was phenomenal, telling a brilliant story of this brand new version of our Ether crew, taking fans through emotional set pieces and action orientated showcases, culminating in a climax that had people asking, is this really the end? And they were absolutely right. The only problem though, outside of the insane Zombies Chronicles that was released around 7 months later, fans were going to have to wait another 2 years to find out what would happen next in the Treyarch world. So in the meantime, what next? It was clear that the world of Zombies was not slowing down, and a new universe was about to appear in the shape of Infinite Warfare. But it was obvious from the outset that things were going to be very different this time around. The seriousness of the Ether story and its maps were gone, replaced by a very slapstick and jokey mode that focused far more on cheesy comedy and experiences that tried to replicate classic movie themes. And although it was accepted with open arms by certain fans, many dismissed it almost immediately as something that would never be able to replicate the Zombies content that they held in such high regard. And so unfortunately, this was considered by some to be the first major stage in the oversaturation of Zombies. But even so, once again, the question from many was, what next? There was still a huge downtime before the continuation of the Black Ops timeline, and with the total lack of success for the IW storyline, things had to go in a very different direction. Sledgehammer stepped up to the plate and decided to do exactly what Infinite Warfare did not: inject some horror back into the world of Zombies. Their take on the mode, just like the attempt that preceded it, was very controversial, and although hugely different to what came before it, was instantly disliked by some and ignored by others. Although it actually brought a lot of fresh ideas to the table, as soon as fans realised how differently it felt to what they'd known and loved, that was it. It was in the bin for them, and the wait began once again. Many players saw the repeated attempts from other studios to fill the gap left by Treyarch as unnecessary, and an attempt to cash in on the success of Black Ops 3. In their eyes, these imposter modes could never live up to the quality of the experiences that birthed this incredible series. And to those same fans, the Primus crew had taken things to new heights in their most recent installment. For them, the only way for the devs to top that was for them to take things to the next level, to create a Zombies experience unlike anything they'd ever seen before. 1 more year, that was all. 365 more days until they could get their hands on the next Ether installment. And surely, based on the quality of Black Ops 3, the next game was going to blow their minds, right? I mean, yeah, sure, I suppose you could put it like that, but in the way they were expecting, maybe not. May 17th, 2018, Los Angeles. The man responsible for the birth of the golden age of Zombies, Jason Blundell, took to the stage, the first major reveal of Black Ops 4 Zombies.
A mysterious new world, sinister villains and engaging heroes, and a riveting story of chaos all forms just one half of the equation. We've seen a taste of what's ahead in our new story, but let's just take a trip back through the ether. Here's a small peek of Black Ops 4's third Zombies map.
And just like that, the fuse had been lit. The already astronomical levels of hype had managed to grow even further. Fans were already expecting good things, but this was unlike anything they could have imagined. This was to be the true arrival of COD Zombies. Treyarch were going full steam ahead here and giving players something that would eclipse everything that had come before it, or at least they hoped it would. It was insane. So many announcements, including major features that had never existed before and sounded like absolute game changers for the Zombies community.
Zombies also now boasts custom mutations, over 100 different customizable options that will allow you to play the game your way. We're also introducing limited time created challenges that we're naming Callings, which will regularly introduce new ways for you to play the game and set the stage for ongoing seasonal content and a few themed experience surprises as well along the way.
As time went on, it became clear things were changing in a big way. Certain classic systems were getting thrown out the window, replaced with more customization, and little did players know it at the time, but this would become a major talking point as the season went on, and one of the first things that played a part in the downfall of something they fully expected to fall in love with.
And when we got to perks, we had this problem. And the problem is that everyone gets the same things. As soon as we took out certain perks, suddenly when I looked at the survey, everything started changing. And I was like, this is what we want. And then people then started to have their own strategies. And then they had different strategies on their own than when they were with friends and with certain friends based on how they play. And we were like, that's what we're after.
The anticipation for the launch only increased as fans gained extra insight into the experiences they'd be getting their hands on, and on top of the information they already had, things were shaping up to be pretty special. As showcased in the Zombies reveal event, players would be flying into a brand new storyline titled Chaos, with them embarking on a perilous mission aboard the Titanic after it had been overrun by the undead. Not only that, but in the same universe, fans would have the chance to jump into what appeared to be an ancient Colosseum-like arena. Interestingly titled Voyage of Despair and 9 respectively, both of these experiences would be available to players at launch. But as incredible as this was, it was only half of the story, with the remaining excitement being focused on the return of the Ether storyline. Players of course already knew about the return of something they'd waited over 5 years for, with Blood of the Dead already having been revealed. This of course was the return of Mob, but this time with a fresh coat of paint, new playable areas and a completely different set of characters appearing on Alcatraz Island. But that was it for Ether up to this point. Fortunately though, Jason Blundell had one more little surprise up his sleeve for fans.
You also announced you're doing a fourth map, Classified,
yes,
right? With
yes.
the Cartesian. All right, getting to the questions you guys want to hear. So, break it down. What can you tell us?
It's going to be based in the Pentagon. So it's the original crew.
Wow.
So it's the Ultimus gang. So Black Ops 4 is going to have our Primus crew in there, and then also our Ultimus crew and our new gang as well.
And just like that, the stage was set for the greatest Zombies launch of all time. 4 maps on day 1, tons of DLC and confirmed features to be added later. It was unheard of. It was all coming true. It was everything that players had hoped for and more. Nothing could spoil this, right? Nothing could go wrong, surely. The time was here, launch day, the full arrival of what many believed would be the greatest ever entry into the Zombies franchise. There was so much content on offer for players that people didn't know what to jump into first. Would they take on the horrors of the brand new Chaos storyline by either jumping aboard the doomed Titanic or take their chances in the gladiatorial arena of 9? Perhaps neither, as many fans understandably wanted to dive straight back into the world of the Ether with the premise crew's arrival on Alcatraz Island, or go for an even bigger throwback as Ultimus, who were arriving at the Pentagon to take on the undead. There could be no doubt that in terms of the quality of the maps available at launch to players, the general response was very positive. The Titanic setting of Voyage of Despair was visually incredible. It had been modelled so well around the real ship, offering players a very unique and interesting play space. It was often considered to be the more difficult of the two launch Chaos maps due to its tight areas and sometimes overwhelming nature. That definitely wasn't the case with 9 though, which was largely people's preferred experience when it came to this brand new storyline. It felt like a pure classic throwback to more old school zombies with its simple 4-pathway setup. One major starting area, 4 separate sections branching off here, each with their own theme, all connected underground through various intricate tunnels and a central pack-a-punch area to connect it all. In terms of design and gameplay, it's safe to say the map was a hit and many fans absolutely loved it. However, one thing that didn't land with a large portion of the player base was the new Chaos story itself. Due to the fact that they'd spent so much time with their previous characters, they just didn't connect with these new personalities, and this even caused some people to ignore this new storyline and solely spend their time in the world of Ether instead. Looking back, there's no doubt that this lack of connection were the first seeds being sown when it comes to negativity surrounding Black Ops 4 and what it would be offering players. Luckily though, there was so much content on offer at launch that even if these people weren't willing to give this new crew a chance, they had 2 other experiences to fill their time. Blood of the Dead of course took the fan favourite Mob of the Dead, but completely reimagined it by expanding on numerous areas to make the map bigger and tell a very different story. In lots of people's eyes, it did so many things right and created one of the most heartbreaking climaxes in Zombies history whilst paying homage to the original. Others, however, were not so complimentary, genuinely believing that it had butchered or even removed the vast majority of things that made Mob so incredible. To those fans, although it may have been graphically impressive, it was a weak imitation and could never live up to one of their favourite maps of all time. Classified on the other hand was much more faithful to BO1's 5, with its biggest change of course being that players were jumping in as Ultimus instead of the ragtag band of political leaders. It took the clean and sometimes sanitised nature of the original Pentagon and tore the place apart, with it now looking run down and truthfully exactly how you would expect for a building firmly in the grip of a zombie apocalypse. In terms of the overall gameplay, there were minimal changes apart from a few new areas, including the extended offices upstairs, a small server room off to the side of the main war room, and a revamped pack-a-punch area. Although players could still access the original room where this took place, things were different this time around. If fans wanted to get hold of weapon upgrades, they would need to teleport themselves over to the famous Groom Lake from Moon. It was considered an awesome little throwback detail and was one of the many reasons that in general the community consensus surrounding Classified was fairly positive. So although some players had certain reservations surrounding various aspects of each experience, you would understandably be forgiven for thinking that the launch of Black Ops 4 Zombies was a huge success. But actually, nothing could be further from the truth, because players quickly learned that lying just below the surface was a game that would never be able to live up to their expectations for a variety of different reasons. And those reasons were about to become pretty clear. Because tragically, it would become very obvious very quickly that it didn't matter which experience players chose, because there was a key problem present across all of the content in the game that would unfortunately become the thing that Black Ops 4's launch was most famous for.
Chat, listen, we are about to go into this boss fight. Hold on, I can't break my good controller. Hold on, this one will work. Treyarch, test your game. Test it.
I want to cry.
Test your game. This is like, I don't think I've had a game where I just died normally in 2 days. Every single one has been a crash.
The game was, at its core, broken. It was simply unstable, and anytime players progressed through an Easter egg quest or began to approach the higher rounds, Black Ops 4 would crash, hours of progress lost in an instant. Fans found it extremely difficult to seriously enjoy any of the content on offer when they knew that their ability to actually play the game was only temporary and would always end up in blue screens, anger and disappointment. These serious issues made it nearly impossible for many players to complete certain main quests, as they weren't even able to get to the end of them without being thrown out of their game by the dreaded sight of pure blue. This became even more of a problem when undertaking one of the craziest Easter eggs of all time on Classified. People discovered that there was in fact an ending cutscene unlockable when playing the Pentagon themed map. But this time around, it was accessed in a completely different way than normal. Fans needed to test out their high round abilities by getting to round 150 and the ending cutscene would play. However, due to the complete lack of stability present across the whole game, this was literally impossible. People couldn't get anywhere near the required round because Black Ops 4 was unable to run for that long without crashing. It was in many players' eyes the final straw when it came to the apparent total lack of testing that this game had undergone before launch. But sadly, these major issues were what many would come to see as the first of many problems with Black Ops 4 Zombies. Because even outside of stability issues, fans began realising that when compared to their beloved Black Ops 3, things definitely weren't as perfect as they'd expected. In fact, many of the things that they'd come to know and love about this series were very different this time around, and they hugely changed the minute-to-minute gameplay of Zombies itself. Prior to the launch of the game, it had been a major talking point in the community that perks were going to be changing in a huge way. Players would now be able to decide exactly what perks they wanted to be available on the map they were playing. It seemed like a great idea, but in reality fans quickly discovered that it sadly removed all of the personality of famous perk machines. Previously, these things were almost like characters themselves, with certain jingles being famous throughout the community, but that was totally gone from BO4. Replaced instead by what felt like soulless substitutes devoid of any personality or joy. And this wasn't the only problem with this huge gameplay shift. The man himself, Jason Blundell, had made it clear prior to launch that the reason for this massive overhaul was to try and change the way fans took on the undead through the use of perks. It had become obvious over the years that the vast majority of players would always choose the same 4 perks when playing a game of zombies. The devs wanted to break this cycle and provide a huge number of customizable perks for fans so that every game could in fact be totally different based entirely on what they decided to take into a map with them. The issue was that people quickly realised certain perks were just way more useful than others, meaning they always ended up using these. Dying Wish, Winter's Wail, Victorious Tortoise are just a few examples of perks which could be the difference between life and death. And so, although the devs had attempted to remove what they would call crutch perks, they'd merely replaced them with others. And when combined with the complete lack of charm and flair for these in-game machines, it really seemed like this experiment had sadly been a total failure. The devs' desire to totally revamp perks had also had another huge consequence for Zombies players. For the first time in the history of Treyarch Zombies, Juggernog no longer existed, it was gone, replaced instead by a completely altered health system. Players were thrown into maps with 200 base health which would constantly replenish when not being attacked, meaning that even from round 1 players were able to take 4 hits from zombies before going down. Which in the eyes of numerous people was unthinkable when casting their minds back to fan favourite Black Ops 3 and how when spawning in players were only able to take 3 shots before hitting the deck. The community consensus on this was that it was just way too easy, giving early parts of Zombies games next to no danger because you could take so much damage before going down. But it wasn't the only significant change to Zombies gameplay that fans would say removed a huge level of challenge that was present in Black Ops 3. Taking inspiration from World War II and of course BO3 Zombies, the devs at Treyarch decided to carry on the tradition of specialist abilities. However, this time around they were taken to the next level. These were no mere tools that could just assist players by giving them invisibility or knocking back the undead. They were largely considered to be the most overpowered thing in the whole of Black Ops 4 Zombies, and were seen by many in the community as something that had no place in this mode due to how easy they made surviving dangerous encounters. And when combined with a number of very overpowered perks and an increase in starting health, a disappointing picture became clear to fans. This was not what they had expected or wanted, and obviously this was massively different to what many considered the peak of Zombies, Black Ops 3. It seems safe to say that in the eyes of the zombies community, the launch of BO4 had been an absolute disaster. It was the complete opposite of what fans were expecting and praying for: instability, huge gameplay changes, and a core system that just made things way too easy. But truthfully, as negative as all of this may seem, it was just the beginning of the downfall of Black Ops 4 Zombies, and the next stage of its collapse would arise once players managed to get their hands on more DLC. Nearly 2 months to the day since the launch of Black Ops 4, its catalogue of content would be expanded, but not in the way players were hoping for. After the tragic demise of Edward Richtofen in the final scenes of Blood of the Dead, huge numbers of fans were extremely excited to see where the Ether story would take them next, only to be massively disappointed when they discovered that at this point in time it wasn't taking them anywhere. Because the first new offering from Treyarch had absolutely nothing to do with the premise crew and instead expanded upon the lore of the brand new Chaos storyline. A decision that was definitely met with huge negativity from a portion of the community who had no interest investing any time in this new story or its characters. And they labelled the arrival of this content as just the next step in the downfall of Black Ops 4 Zombies. But ask yourself, what would be the best way to promote fresh content for the Chaos crew and an upcoming brand new DLC? Trailers, teasers, detailed blog posts surrounding the content found within? Sure, you'd be forgiven for thinking that that would be a good idea because it's what is generally expected. So what exactly did Treyarch decide to do? Next to none of that. In fact, the marketing and promotion of DLC 1, Dead of the Night, was essentially non-existent. The map launched out of nowhere on December the 11th with a trailer going up at the same time. It caught the community completely off guard, with many zombie players having absolutely no idea that new content was even available. Treyarch were off to a pretty dreadful start with DLC 1, and fans would soon come to realise that the whole premise of Dead of the Night was another issue altogether. It became pretty obvious as soon as fans jumped in to play as a brand new celebrity cast that things were a little bit off timeline wise. The whole Chaos story appeared to be totally out of order, with Dead of the Night actually being a prequel. Well, at least that's what fans thought. In reality, there's the chance that this was never the plan at all, and that would become more clear slightly later on. In a Twitter Q&A, Jason Blundell responded to a fan saying, Dead of the Night was always intended to have a celebrity cast, and so due to kind of recording schedules and so forth, we had to put it later in the schedule. And so this left people wondering, maybe all along Dead of the Night was never supposed to be DLC 1? Was it in fact initially planned to be a launch map until that was no longer possible and the whole schedule had to be switched around? Although Treyarch would never admit this and many fans disputed the claim, it would have explained so much surrounding the Chaos story and how previous launch maps detailed certain things about Dead of the Night, even though at that point fans had never even played it. It seemed a bit confusing at the time, but now it was all clear. Many players believed it was because it was never supposed to be this way, and Treyarch had been scrambling to try and make all the pieces of this puzzle fit together in any way they could. In terms of the content on offer with DLC 1, those fans who'd embraced the Chaos crew and its narrative were actually massively impressed with Dead of the Night. It was considered to be visually pretty stunning and an experience that provided players with a great combination of classic zombies gameplay combined with new mythical creatures such as werewolves and vampires. There was, however, a portion of the community, both Chaos fans and haters alike, who had some major problems with this map due to its collectathon style nature. Not since the days of Black Ops 2's origins had players needed to spend so long searching insane numbers of different spawn locations to find parts for various tools in order to assist them against the horde of the undead. On top of that, many people had massively negative opinions around the difficulty of certain in-game mechanics such as Pack-a-Punch. It was considered to be one of the most convoluted and challenging quests of this nature ever seen in a zombies map. And so for that reason was just sadly another thing that really put off certain players, even those willing to give the experience a chance who had previously written off the Chaos storyline. Frustration began to boil over in the zombies community due to the fact that they felt like once again they had received content that they didn't want. They were largely very much looking for an expansion of the Ether timeline, and that was not what they got, which unfortunately just generated even more resentment towards this new group of characters that certain players felt were being forced upon them. To add further bitterness to the situation, many people felt like this was the first instance of Treyarch not dropping map-based content that they were expecting. The previously announced faction system was nowhere to be seen, and although at this point in time it wasn't a major problem with it still only being around 2 months after the game's launch, it was sadly the initial glimpse of a company who had promised certain features that would never materialise. Although there was understandably a lot of negativity floating around in the community, it wasn't all bad though, with Treyarch even dropping other new features for fans in between round-based zombies experiences. A brand new gauntlet mode was added, allowing players to take on round-based objectives in different maps, which provided experiences with a whole new level of difficulty. Only giving fans a certain number of lives to complete these gauntlets was very different to what they were used to, and although not perfect, it certainly gave players some very good content to keep them coming back to the game. However, as unique and interesting as this was, it didn't really solve a number of core issues with Black Ops 4 that were pushing fans away even more as the DLC cycle went on, and in the eyes of some people, that major problem continued with DLC 2. It had been clear since launch that unfortunately the Chaos story was not landing with a large portion of the player base, which is why a huge number of people were very much hoping for a return to the world of Aether with DLC 2, but it was not to be. This content drop would instead focus on the culmination of the Chaos Crew's adventure, meaning that in the near 6 months since the release of Black Ops 4 there had been no new Aether experiences, and that for many was a serious problem. For those who had been willing to give this fresh set of characters a chance though, they quickly discovered what they would describe as one of the most visually impressive and complete zombies experiences since Black Ops 3. The environment they found themselves in with the city of Delphi was quite frankly phenomenal and gave them everything they were looking for when it came to wrapping up the Chaos story for Black Ops 4. Incredible wonder weapons, powerful new enemies, and a boss fight to rival the coolest of all time, Ancient Evil essentially had all of the boxes checked for a top level zombies experience. Its only crime not being part of the Aether timeline, and sadly that's something that a lot of fans couldn't look past. It didn't matter how good Ancient Evil actually was because many players were never willing to give it a chance in the first place. They felt like Treyarch had betrayed them by implementing a number of huge changes in their beloved series that they never wanted and sidelining the characters they had spent years developing a bond with. Ironically though, for the first time since the launch of Black Ops 4, the arrival of Ancient Evil had in some ways caused a shift in some other players' perspectives. This was the first time many fans had taken a step back and said, okay, wow, this map is actually pretty incredible. Maybe this storyline is genuinely worth giving a chance. It was the only time up to this point where some people were actually interested in this crew and narrative, and the conclusion of Ancient Evil's main quest really helped with this. It set things up for the future with incredible teases and left things on a pretty insane cliffhanger, finally making more fans want more of this. The only problem here, there was no more. That was it, the end of the Chaos storyline. Treyarch had finally managed to achieve exactly what they set out to do with this new crew, and there was now nowhere for them to go with it. All of that hard work was essentially squandered because, as people now know, there would never be a proper follow-up to this due to the total lack of popularity for this storyline prior to this point. It would only ever be touched on again in Black Ops 6 with various nods to this universe and of course some more obvious links with the Dark Aether storyline. But as much of a change in attitudes that there was, of course caused by Ancient Evil, to some it was still not enough. This was not the content they were looking for and they made their opinions known. For those people, DLC 2 was the final straw and there was no coming back for Black Ops 4 Zombies in their eyes. They believed they'd been lied to about the experiences they were going to be getting and saw the sidelining of their favourite characters as unacceptable. And once again, promised content that was nowhere to be seen. The elusive Factions update never materialised, with many people believing that it was never arriving and had been left on the cutting room floor. For a certain section of the community, Black Ops 4 had nothing left to offer them and it meant the end of their time with the game. But for those who had been willing to stick with Treyarch through thick and thin, their time had come. The time for the return of their beloved premise crew. More Aether content was finally on its way, but not in the way people expected. And although this was something fans had longed for many months, it would end up being the thing that caused the true downfall of Black Ops 4 Zombies. The time was finally here, the thing that fans had been clinging onto to save Black Ops 4 Zombies, the continuation of the Aether story, the chance to once again play as their beloved premise crew. And after the tragic demise of their version of Edward Richtofen at the end of Blood of the Dead and a dramatic cliffhanger ending as part of the hidden cutscene in Classified, it's fair to say that players' expectations were extremely high as they prepared to fight in what they believed would finally be the Great War map that they had been waiting many years for. Unfortunately, what fans would actually receive instead would be very different. Rumblings had begun in the community prior to the release of DLC 3 that this experience would in fact, just like Blood of the Dead, be a reimagining of a classic map. At launch, this wasn't considered a big deal in the minds of many players due to the fact that fans had wanted a Mob of the Dead remake for years, and so getting a new take on Alcatraz was something they had been hyped to see. And of course, Classified was considered more of a bonus map, so getting to play as Ultimus in the Pentagon was still a big positive for players. But these same fans were very much under the impression that whenever new Aether content dropped after this, it would 100% be original and be very much worth the wait. As soon as they discovered that DLC 3 known as Alpha Omega was in fact going to be a new version of Nuketown from Black Ops 2, it's fair to say that community negativity rocketed to an all-time high. Immediately, the backlash towards Treyarch started. To these players, this was not new content and it was not what they had waited for. It was a reuse of old assets with some fresh packaging and it was not going to cut it. Even though things were clearly going to be expanded in a big way here, it was not enough to keep people happy. An overhauled and more in-depth map wasn't going to satisfy fans that had waited this long for fresh Aether content, so the devs also decided to go even deeper.
So we had Primus and Ultimus face to face. Where are we going to go from there? Well, guess what Idiot Craig decided? Let's put them all in one map and double the narrative workload. So that's what we did.
8 playable characters, 2 versions of each member of our beloved crew, and an insane amount of interaction between all of them. But was this going to be the thing that made people happy about the return of Nuketown to Zombies? Truthfully, no it wasn't. Nothing was going to achieve that except new original content, and this was definitely not that. Unfortunately, even once fans got their chance to finally jump into the map, their expectations hit a new low. They had spent the last 6 experiences getting to watch some pretty visually stunning intro cinematics. Even with all of the game's problems and shortcomings, one thing that most people could agree on was that the maps were all set up with some pretty incredible intros, and sadly that all fell apart with Alpha Omega. It was evident immediately that the production budget had been slashed heavily. The days of high quality intro cutscenes were over, replaced instead by an animated collection of drawn still images, very much feeling like a throwback to Black Ops 2, but not in a good way. With this definitely feeling like the first piece of a puzzle, it all became obvious. It made so much sense. Money had been absolutely gutted from Zombies due to poor performance, and this experience was the result. This is why Alpha Omega was a reimagining of Nuketown instead of something totally new. Treyarch were doing their absolute best with what Activision was willing to give them, and unfortunately it was immediately obvious to fans. Although Nuketown itself had been expanded fairly extensively with the addition of many new areas including a huge in-depth underground bunker, it was still very clear that the devs had been forced to reuse numerous other things from Zombies' history. The level of fan frustration reached new heights when they discovered that there wasn't even a fresh wonder weapon included as part of Alpha Omega. Treyarch had needed to dig into their back catalogue of classics by bringing back the Raygun Mark II. Certain players appreciated the work they'd put in to create some pretty awesome new variants, all with their own unique abilities. Others, however, saw it as nothing more than an attempt to mask the fact that they hadn't been able to provide players with something truly original. And when this was combined with various gameplay mechanics in Alpha Omega, not only did it make some fans feel like they'd been slightly scammed, it actually went further and unfortunately angered them that they had been given an experience that was outright annoying and frustrating. The expanded areas of Nuketown available in Alpha Omega, namely the large underground bunker, were considered by many to be almost unusable. After spending some serious time in the map, many players realised that when accessing this area they would cause the constant spawning of Nova bombers, which may seem like nothing, but when you realise the fact that one of their main forms of attack is massively buffing zombies to the point where they require ridiculous amounts of damage to take down, you have yourself a serious problem. It essentially meant that fans couldn't spend any time in one of the major new areas of the map without being frustrated to the point where they didn't even want to play Alpha Omega anyway. It was a huge error from the devs at Treyarch because not only were players already massively disappointed that they weren't getting original Aether content, but now they considered the new content that they actually did get pretty much unplayable. There was a silver lining though. At the culmination of the map's main quest, the outro cutscene finally teased something for DLC 4 that fans had been waiting to get their hands on for years.
We're going to fight the war, Eddie. The great war. Then, we're going back to the house to kill him and burn it all to the ground.
It seemed like it was finally happening. The ending of the Black Ops 4 story was going to wrap things up in the most insane way possible. Players were at last going to take part in a great war map, right? Wrong. The time had come for the end of Black Ops 4. How were the devs going to conclude everything that had built up over the last 10 years? How were they going to round out the famous Ether storyline? This was to be their final chance to give players a brand new, totally fresh, never before seen experience. Would they be able to do that? Sadly, that question was answered very quickly, and the answer was no. The Zombies budget had been slashed so heavily at this point that once again, just like Alpha Omega, Treyarch were going to have to give fans a reimagining of a classic experience. It wasn't all negative though, because it turned out that DLC 4, known as Tag the Totem, was in fact going to be a new version of an absolute classic that players had asked for years, Call of the Dead. So despite players' anger and their reservations, there were certain positives. The devs were finally letting fans relive something that they had wanted for a very long time. But was this something people would accept as a replacement for totally new content that was designed to wrap up their beloved Ether storyline? Absolutely 100% not. Although some fans were hyped for their return to Siberia, the vast majority of the community saw this as nothing different to Alpha Omega that they'd previously jumped into. It was reused content with a fresh coat of paint and a few extra playable spaces. And even more so, many people immediately began asking why the hell were the devs teasing fans with being part of the Great War at the end of Alpha Omega if they never had any intentions of following through with that. It was seen as a total bait and switch and only served to develop more anger in the Zombies community. Even with players' attitudes being pretty clear, there were however some that were willing to give Tag the Totem a chance. But once again, another motivation roadblock was thrown their way. Fans were not even going to be able to finish off the Ether story by playing as either Primus or Ultimus. In a shock turn of events, people saw the return of Victus from Black Ops 2, and although once again this was something many fans had asked for a long time, to do it for the final map in the original Ether timeline was seen as a massive mistake by the majority of the community. It was sadly one of the final steps in the downfall of Black Ops 4 Zombies, but as for Tag the Totem's content itself, that's another story. There is no doubt that the map was visually pretty stunning. It took the original Call of the Dead playspace and completely transformed the look of it. Gone was the dramatic fog and dark skies. Instead, it was replaced by a beautiful sunset and insane visuals that in some ways made it feel like you were playing a completely different experience. And of course, just like Alpha Omega, it provided numerous brand new areas for fans to discover, making the map at least feel slightly original in some ways. Sadly though, that originality only extended so far, as once again players were stuck using a number of reused wonder weapons as they did their best to take on the undead in Siberia and discover the final conclusion to the Ether storyline. And that culmination of a near 10-year narrative could in fact be one of the most controversial things about the whole of Black Ops 4 Zombies. Of course, understandably, fans were expecting a giant, dramatic, grandiose climax to the Ether story, and it seems fair to say that that is exactly the opposite of what they got. After the Victus crew had been tricked into assisting our beloved main characters for the purposes of finally ending this madness, it turned out that the end of both Primus and Ultimus was in fact not what many players were hoping for. It was understated, reserved and completely undramatic as they were poisoned in a forest by recent new leader Nikolai. Many fans made it clear that this was completely the opposite of what they wanted, and it felt like a weak and unfair final ending for these characters that the community had spent so long with. This wasn't the case for everyone though, as even with all the negativity floating around, some believed the final moments of the Ether story to be incredibly emotionally impactful, and although not what they were expecting, still did an amazing job of wrapping up this world that they'd spent nearly a decade in, even generating some pretty raw reactions from streamers.
This is actually playable. What? Okay. I can't take this anymore. I didn't think I was gonna cry this much, but I really did. This has been like 10 years of my life.
Although clearly some fans actually thought this was a very unique and beautiful way to wrap up this much-loved storyline, the overall consensus was that this was never supposed to be the way that Primus and Ultimus actually went out. Many players were convinced that this weak conclusion was solely the result of major budget cuts and Activision forcing Treyarch to move large numbers of staff away from Black Ops 4 in order for them to work on the next entry in the franchise. It had been massively evident since the launch of the game that Treyarch had done numerous different things that had caused them to completely lose the trust of the zombies community, which had evidently led to massive drops in players. Their desire to experiment and push this franchise in completely different directions had angered many old school zombies players and caused them to abandon the franchise they'd once loved. But out of all of the things that had disappointed fans, the lackluster ending to the much loved Aether storyline was considered by many to be the most unforgivable. It was seen as the final nail in the coffin for a game that had unfortunately in the eyes of many totally destroyed every bit of positivity that had been built up by the brilliant Black Ops 3. This game was supposed to take zombies to the next level and had tragically done the exact opposite and driven many long-term fans away from the game mode that they loved. At the time all this was happening, it was considered the biggest failure in zombies history and there was nothing but pure negativity dominating the community. It was understandably described as the downfall of COD Zombies, but looking back this many years after the experiment that was Black Ops 4, were things really as bad as many people made out? It's pretty evident that at the time, in the midst of the Black Ops 4 lifecycle, as fans were knee-deep in the unravelling of their favourite game mode, that this was to a lot of people the worst thing that could have ever happened to zombies. It had taken what they loved, what had been developed throughout Black Ops 3, and turned it into something that these fans never wanted. Their expectations at the beginning had never been higher, but their views at the end were lower than ever before. But in hindsight, was how people felt about Black Ops 4 Zombies totally justified or a complete overreaction? Truthfully, there is no right or wrong answer here. It's understandable how the major gameplay changes to zombies implemented in Black Ops 4 were not something that was received well by fans. The changes to the perk system, although a cool idea on paper, sadly removed a lot of personality from the game and realistically didn't even solve the problem it set out to fix. This, along with certain other additions such as specialist abilities, absolutely made the early round gameplay way too easy for some, often totally removing any level of danger or difficulty, which was a huge problem and something that was certainly a mistake even looking back this many years later. But one issue that can never be forgiven no matter how far into the future of zombies we go is how completely and utterly unstable Black Ops 4 Zombies was upon release. Never before or since has there been an entry into the franchise as broken as this. It was totally unplayable in a lot of scenarios, and when that's your first offering to fans at launch, a game that can barely even be played without crashing, it's fair to say your product is pretty much doomed from the start. All of this snowballed into such a huge wave of negativity that Activision totally gutted the Treyarch budget, essentially deleting plans for tons of future content such as the ever-elusive factions mode and a whole host of other stuff. It stopped this game in its tracks, and it's very clearly something that it was never able to recover from. The Black Ops 4 experience was understandably believed to be massively flawed in many different ways that I've already covered, but looking back, one major part of the game that perhaps didn't deserve the hate that it got was the actual content. It's no secret that the Chaos story was never given a fair chance by a large portion of the community. But even a lot of those people looking back now have come to realise that that side of Black Ops 4 actually gave fans some truly brilliant experiences. Every single Chaos map was massively unique, visually stunning and incredibly impressive for many different reasons. At the time, many players were unable to see this due to their frustration surrounding it not being part of the Aether story. But now, many years later, a lot of the Chaos content has actually become massively loved by a whole host of players. Certain maps such as Ancient Evil are even in fact considered to be up there with the greatest of all time by many Zombies players, which is pretty insane considering the reception of the Chaos storyline at the time. As for Aether experiences, they're not necessarily looked back on so fondly, although it's important to mention that they are largely nowhere near as hated as they were at the time of release. Blood of the Dead has certainly become quite a controversial map over the years, with many believing it fails in comparison to the original Mob of the Dead. Others, however, see it as a brilliant entry into the franchise with an extremely challenging main quest and incredible storyline conclusion. In the eyes of many fans though, Alpha Omega and Tag the Totem unfortunately remain what they see as pretty poor quality experiences. Alpha Omega is largely still massively disliked by a huge number of players due to its frustrating game mechanics and poorly thought out design. Tag to Totem slightly less so, with it generally still being regarded as visually very impressive, but sadly nowhere near as unique as the original Call of the Dead, with it having removed nearly all of the mechanics that made that experience so interesting. So although clearly certain aspects of Black Ops 4 Zombies have fared better over the many years since it originally released, it is still seen by most as a complete catastrophe. Never before or since has Zombies been set up so perfectly to achieve things that many thought were impossible. Black Ops 3 created the perfect scenario for Treyarch by allowing them to develop the most insane levels of hype in the community that will probably never be replicated. And so when Black Ops 4 rolled around, they could do whatever they wanted, and it turns out that that was actually not a good thing at all. They shook up the core Zombies formula so heavily that their core fanbase didn't even recognise it anymore. These players merely wanted Black Ops 3 Part 2, and what they got was something that for many different reasons was never able to come close to achieving the success of those glory days. As sad as it may sound, Black Ops 4 was almost directly responsible for destroying the trust of a large portion of the COD Zombies community. So much so that Treyarch found themselves needing to do a heavy reset with the arrival of Cold War. It was the only direction they could go in, a reboot to try and undo the mistakes of the past. But even with that, it's clear for most people to see that still to this day, fans' connection to the Zombies universe is just nowhere near as high as it was previously. And a lot of that comes down to some of the baffling decisions made by the devs all those years ago, and what is looked back on and remembered as the major downfall of Black Ops 4 Zombies.